It's Ron Reader Digs the Universe. I'm Ron Reader, and this is Ron Reader Digs the Universe, and tonight, inflation. Always of interest, even when people are barely talking about it, inflation is now center stage for our ongoing economic discourse. It's time that I address it. There is a sort of American mythology regarding the notion of inflation. The last time it was a real issue for this country was the 1970s, and the popular understanding is that LBJ's guns and butter approach, increases in both military and domestic budgets simultaneously, is what started the inflationary spiral, which then became self-sustaining as people would spend more now, expecting price increases next week. Few establishment observers, though, talk about the gasoline supply crunches of the 70s, which is what likely kept inflation a continuing issue. Regardless of the cause, though, government spending got and still gets the blame to this day. Reagan managed to put a stop to it by dramatically jacking up interest rates, which effectively drained dollars from the money supply. It caused a recession. Millions lost their jobs. Forget spend now, forget that much needed bypass surgery. For now, just forget spending generally. And poof, no more runaway inflation. So the inside the Beltway Washington D.C. consensus is today more or less that big government causes inflation and only the GOP knows how to fix it. One of the fake lessons of the Gipper era. Now, just to make sure we're all on the same page, let's talk about what inflation is exactly for a moment. Inflation describes the economic conditions such that there are too many dollars in the system attempting to purchase too few goods. We see this at the consumer level in terms of rising prices at the store, but make no mistake, inflation applies to every single transaction up and down the supply chain. Now, some bit of inflation is good, if only to provide new dollars to cover the increasing number of transactions in a growing economy. But we're worried about too much inflation, which, if left unchecked, greatly slows down an economy. Government spending can, in fact, cause inflation, for better or worse, but it is by no means the only economic factor that can cause inflation. The aforementioned gas shocks of the 1970s, or just rising oil prices generally, or an overheated economy, Greenspan's irrational exuberance, stupid investment bubbles and shit like the tech sector in the 90s or the home mortgage sector in the 2000s. Pretty much anything that grossly warps value, supply, and or demand can cause inflation. Our current high inflation rate, 7.5%, is not the result of government spending. All the COVID payouts are over now. Spent, respent, and then spent again. It is crazy to blame this on life-saving social spending that no longer exists. Nor is current inflation due to irrational exuberance. Indeed, the economy is still recovering from the pandemic recession, and there is a lot of room for economic growth. Rather, inflation today is being driven by some other factors which aren't being discussed enough by the mainstream. Lefty podcaster Sam Seder calls it abnormal, not real inflation, in that it follows first a steep COVID-related drop in demand, followed by production cuts as companies scramble to cut their losses, followed by a steep pandemic restriction easing related rise in demand, now followed by companies scrambling to ramp up production in order to meet returning demand. Throw in labor shortage problems, combine it with COVID absenteeism, and you have a supply crunch, all of which results in higher prices. Economist and former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich observes that certain key consumer markets have become so monopolized that corporations not facing competition from competitors are just price gouging now in spite of record profits and blaming it on inflation. Indeed, it is estimated that 4 of the 7.5 points of our current inflation rate comes from precisely this kind of monopolistic price gouging. Fucking half of it. But the Federal Reserve Board is ready to use the Reagan approach to fighting this, jacking up interest rates, even though it's pretty clear that putting the brakes on the economy in this way won't even begin to resolve the actual underlying problems causing prices to rise. That is, the supermarket shelves will still be empty on some aisles, and now you'll have less money to buy stuff in any case. Maybe not even a job. I mean, monetary policy is just, it's totally the wrong weapon here, aimed at the wrong enemy. It will force cuts to social services during a deadly pandemic, no less. It will tighten school funding. It cause some businesses to permanently close their doors, all kinds of bad stuff. Instead, we've just got to ride this shit out. Do what we can to keep the inflation from becoming self-perpetuating. The pandemic will end, and all these COVID economic problems will end with it. And, oh yeah, as Reich says, break up the damned monopolies. Capitalism must have competition in order to do what it is supposed to do. I'm Ron Reeder, and this has been Ron Reeder Digs the Universe. Join me, Ron Reeder, again next week for another episode of Ron Reeder Digs the Universe. So I'm banned from Facebook for a fucking week, and get this, I stand accused or judged of harassment and bullying because, get this, in one comment, this is harassment, you know, in one comment, I told a conservative guy that his emoji was drooling and had hillbilly hygiene problems. His fucking emoji!